What is China's intent in Myanmar? The coup has created problems and opportunities for Beijing. The Chinese Communist Party has well-documented disputes with its neighbors. Top of the list are consistent and escalating threats to invade Taiwan and force it to become part of mainland China. It has also ongoing disputes with its neighbors in the South China Sea, most notably the Philippines and Vietnam, which also has a new dispute over territorial waters in the Gulf of Tonkin, in the East China Sea with Japan, in the Himalayas with Bhutan, as well as with India, and the line of actual control. This does not include, quote, internal, end quote, issues such as repression in Tibet and the Uyghur Muslims in Western China, the raiding of international fisheries, damming rivers which is cutting off flow of water to its southern neighbors, or the repression in Hong Kong. At some point, the world must ask China, it's not me, it's you. Now the Chinese leadership is ratcheting up the pressure in Myanmar to serve its own purposes. In February 2021, Myanmar's military overthrew the democratic government and replaced it with the military junta. The Chinese play a major role in Myanmar due to sharing a common border, so it is impacted by the coup. China is Myanmar's biggest trading partner and has maintained an economic interest in the country. The democratic government prior to the coup had friendly relations with China, but was also willing to reach out to outside world to seek economic development. This gave the government a tool to leverage more favorable terms for economic development by creating conditions that did not solely rely on China for development. China's interest in Myanmar includes the Belt and Road Initiative projects to improve the infrastructure, as Myanmar provided China direct access to the Indian Ocean. Therefore, Myanmar was of strategic importance to China in this strategy to have presence in the Indian Ocean. Other Chinese activities include mining of rare earth metals in northern states of Myanmar, which includes large numbers of Chinese citizens working inside the border. The coup by the military junta, which China did not play a role in, eventually provided an opportunity for China to take advantage of strengthening its position in the country. The Chinese reaction to the coup, though initially cautious, was one of support as it called the coup, quote, major cabinet reshuffle, end quote, and fried the country's military rulers with $250 million in arms sales. The arms were needed as the coup precipitated a civil war that is ongoing and has killed thousands and has displaced nearly 2 million people. The coup and its crackdown on dissent have led to international sanctions, but China has ignored the sanctions and has defended the military leaders of the country by using its power in the UN Security Council to limit any significant sanctions from that body. It has publicly defended the junta by stating that any sanctions in the West were exacerbating tensions inside the country and the civil war. China, in return, has been allowed nearly exclusive development rights in the country as the sanctions led other countries to pull out. The situation in Myanmar was in China's favor, but the issues of the ongoing civil war was a concern. In October 2023, the situation deteriorated in northern Myanmar when a combined militia force based on 3 militia groups formed along ethnic lines called the Three Brotherhood Alliance has become a major challenge to the Myanmar army and had taken control of 4 border crossings with China and had established its strength in the jungle area along the Chinese border. China was supporting the militia with the operations of the Three Brotherhood Alliance having ties to the Chinese security services, which was probably China hedging its bets to influence the militias in its favor and playing both sides in the conflict to wield influence no matter who prevails in the long run. So despite the ongoing support that China gives the junta, both militarily and diplomatically, why would China choose to assist the rebel groups fighting against the junta that was so supportive and dependent on China? The reason for the change in China's position, though not turning its back on the junta, is a situation on its border was that China was experiencing economic headwinds, and the situation on the border with Myanmar was adding to the economic headwinds of China, so it decided to address the situation in the short term as well. Long term was so that China has influence in Myanmar no matter what government prevails. The ongoing civil war had severed the Chinese link to the Indian Ocean and had disrupted the border trade between the two countries. The city of Lingang, in the Chinese Yunnan province on the Myanmar border, is an example of the economic cost of the situation in Myanmar. The city was expecting a 15% increase in cross-border trade, a 12% increase in investment, and this was to support the GDP growth target in the province of a plus 7% versus last year. Other cities in Yunnan are expecting similar results, but the border being contested, the likelihood of making these growth targets were rapidly diminishing. The result is that China needs to take more aggressive action to serve its own economic interest. The border had become porous with little border control as the Three Brother Alliance and Myanmar Army were contesting for control of the border as of late 2023. With major military defeats of the junta, the army lost ground along the border. Chinese crime syndicates had also set up operations inside Myanmar border and were free to operate due to the contested security situation, which probably involved the security services being negotiating with the Three Brothers militia. The loss of international trade placing more pressure on the national economy of China, the lack of border control, and the cutting off of access to the Indian Ocean, China decided, despite its support of the junta, negotiated with rebel groups operating along the border with the intent to negotiate a ceasefire and restore some order on the border. China negotiated a ceasefire agreement in January 2024 between the various ethnic militias and the junta, but the ceasefire quickly fell apart as fighting continued. The fighting had resulted in some mortar rounds and airstrikes landing inside China, as well as the fighting impact Chinese workers that worked inside Myanmar close to the border. China, dissatisfied with the border situation, deployed the People's Liberation Army, PLA, along the border to conduct live fire and air defensive exercises. China stated the purpose of the drills was air defense, reconnaissance, and repulsion of incursion of the border. It appears that China is signaling that it will use military force to take control of the border if the situation does not improve to China's satisfaction. The exercises are expected to run through this week. China's apparent willingness to exert control over the border region is not about stopping the junta, but from committing human rights violations and restoring peace. It's about China's short and long-term financial and strategic interest in Myanmar. China's priority is it wants stability and not restoration of human rights, so that in the short term it can restore cross-border trade, close down the Chinese crime syndicates operating outside of China's control, allowing the restart of the Belt and Road Initiative projects, and secure reopening of its access to the Indian Ocean. Long term, it sees Myanmar in its sphere of influence and wants to exert control over the country to secure its access to the Indian Ocean. So China's interest would be served making Myanmar a client state to China. So it needs a governing body that is too weak and easy to influence. China knows that the junta is weak and that it makes it susceptible to foreign influence. China desires to fill that void of foreign influence and keep the West and countries in the region out of Myanmar. China views the junta as the most likely party that will prevail in the country, and a non-democratic form of governance that China can influence will be more likely to provide China the preferred stability. It also knows that the junta is not strong enough to secure China's short-term goal, so it will maintain relations with the militias in the region to also exert influence over them, though China will not get the stability from these groups as it would through the junta. It is unclear how China will use the PLA to settle the situation, or if it is counting on the live fire exercises and employment to the border as being enough to bring the parties back to the Chinese brokered ceasefire. China is portraying itself in the world as the peacemaker in Myanmar, but that is a deflection to what China intends. It wants a weak and pliable Myanmar that will provide the stability in the country, will keep out foreign influence and investment out, serve its economic and strategic security interests. China's efforts are not benevolence, but a desire to exert control for its own self-serving interests and not the interests of the Myanmar people.